My guest this evening is Chris Leithner from Leithner and Company. Chris, thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Steve.
Tell me why it is or tell me what the phrase quantitative easing means.
Quantitative easing is, to a great extent, a weasel phrase, but let me explain it. It refers to the creation by a central bank, like the Bank of England, like the Federal Reserve in Washington, of unlimited amounts of money within quotations, not real money, but funny money. They're literally conjuring things out of thin air.
So they're doing exactly what the Federal Reserve does, is they create money out of thin air and they pyramid debt. That's where the bubble comes from. That's why you have to look at monetary policy.
Yeah. But the credit crisis is real, and it can't be solved by the government printing money. The credit is gone because the savings are gone.
Adrian, when you print gigantic amounts of money and you flood the world with money, throughout history, that has led to inflation. What I said was we're coming out of this. They're setting the stage for when we come out of this of a massive inflationary holocaust was the word I used.
This potentially unlimited increase in the supply of money is different from what central banks had been doing over the past several years. They target a particular type of rate of interest. In Australia, it's called an overnight cash rate, and they have to adjust the supply of money in order to match that particular rate of interest. But once that rate of interest falls, or once they push it far below a market level, they basically abandon that sort of a policy. They abandon even the pretext of prudence, and they basically say, gee, we're just going to print as much of this stuff as we possibly can. Now, why on earth would they do that? The underlying economic fallacy here, and I think it is a fallacy, is that borrowing and spending will somehow pull countries out of the problems. That borrowing and spending leads to prosperity. They've got it precisely backwards. They've utterly and totally forgotten that it's savings first, which leads to production. Once you produce, then you can consume. So it's, if you like, the first stage in the process is always savings. The last step, if the savings is done properly, if the production is done efficiently, then we have prosperity. But to short-circuit that and simply to try to print money and to encourage people to borrow and spend, no, that's not going to solve anything.
So quantitative easing is really a weasel word. It's really just a way of saying we're going to print money, but we're going to try and give it a very formal-sounding title.
It's that, and in fact it's more than that. It's legalised, it's licensed counterfeiting.
ABC Local Radio.
Hopefully we've got our gremlins sorted out. If you've just tuned in, my name's Steve Austin. This is ABC Local Radio. I'm speaking with Chris Leithner from Leithner and Company. Chris, is that better now?
I hope it is.
It's much clearer, much clearer. Now, we were talking about the UK phrase of quantitative easing. Mm-hmm. You've argued that this is simply licensed counterfeiting. Now, of course, the central banks are the place that actually orders the printing of money.
Yep.
They're trying to get themselves out of a deep financial hole. They're trying to stimulate their economy and give it an impetus where people can actually start where banks will lend more money to people so that those people will spend money to start getting the economy of the United Kingdom flowing in a more free manner. Mm-hmm. Why isn't printing money to get it out there for banks a way of doing it?
Well, simply put, to print money puts funny money out there into the real world, but it doesn't produce a single additional widget or car, any sort of a good or service. Now, it may well change who's buying or who's spending that sort of a money, but for example, take the so-called cash splash in this country. People receive a check in the post or electronically into the bank account. They rush off to the shops. The widget which you buy is the widget thereby which I cannot buy. The total number of widgets or the goods and services which are available for purchase hadn't changed one iota. It's simply given some people a leg up such that they can be first in the queue or move further to the head of the queue. But the critical point is, in order to extricate ourselves from our economic problems, the problem is not a shortfall of what's called demand. My demand for Mercedes and for expensive beachfront property and for 6-month overseas holidays, that's limitless. What's limited is my ability to finance that, and ultimately that comes from my willingness to consume less today to save up so that I can afford the car or the house or the holiday or whatever it is.
Now, why would they do it? This is the Bank of England, Chris Leithner.
Yes.
This is,
Yep.
previously one of the most credible financial institutions in the world. They
Yes.
made their reputation, if you like, particularly in the last 2 centuries prior
Yes.
to this one, for being, for showing great fiscal restraint. For being very conservative in their lending practices. for knowing how to balance the books.
I'm not sure I'd accept the characterization. I'd add, though, that the Federal Reserve in the United States since about October or November of last year has done similar sorts of things. The Bank of Japan at certain points beginning in the early 1990s, and most egregiously, most shockingly of all, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe.
So the precedent for this in recent memory is Japan in the 1990s?
Yes.
Did that work?
No.
And the most recent example in Africa is Zimbabwe?
Which has run the economy utterly and completely into the ground. In other words, well, as you'd well know, as your listeners would well know, extreme poverty is the rule there. So the short answer to your question is no. Simply printing money does nothing.
Now, why would they try and do it? I mean, they must know. Well, I mean, I assume it devalues the currency.
Precisely.
So what's the mistake that's being made then?
The great fear, utterly and completely misplaced. It is misinterpreting or learning the wrong lessons from the 1930s and the Great Depression of the 1930s. Central bankers and politicians will say to themselves, whatever we do, we mustn't let prices fall.
And then in the Depression, what did we try to do? We tried to fix prices, which is exactly what we're doing now. We would not, in the Depression, allow wages to go down, and we said, well, the price of farm products has to stay up. So in doing that, we plowed crops under, and people were starving. The market is demanding the liquidation of debt and let prices fall. You don't want to keep housing prices artificially high. You want the housing prices to come down so people who have saved, who qualify, can buy houses. But to keep up prices high automatically is price fixing, and price fixing destroys the market. That's what socialism is all about. That's why socialism fails.
Why? Because for a debtor, a decrease of prices is an absolute hell. Say for mortgage holders, they bought the house for the sake of argument at $300,000. The market price goes down to $200,000, and yet their mortgage is rock solid. Hasn't gone down at all. The answer to your question is, I think this is a misguided and ultimately failed attempt to prevent or to mitigate a decrease of prices in things like residential real estate, in things like wages, in things like stock and bond prices. I return to the Japanese example. Commercial real estate there, you can draw a graph. It's a jagged graph, but it's basically been falling despite all of these efforts by the Bank of Japan. It's continued to fall. In other words, natural laws of economics will have their way. They'll win out in the end, regardless of the extent to which this artificial money is going to be printed.
When I've interviewed you in the past on ABC Radio, you said that governments, I think, misunderstand the difference between value and surface wealth of money, that they misunderstand that because a $100 bill says it's a $100 bill doesn't mean it is. What that $100 bill means is